Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast. From ad hoc to automated, proven techniques to operationalize threat hunting, sponsored by Red Canary. My name is Carol Auth of the SANS Institute, and I will be moderating today's webcast. Today's featured speaker is Joe Moles, Director of Detection Operations at Red Canary. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenter, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to hand the webcast over to Joe.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining. We're going to be talking about moving your threat hunt processes and operations towards a operationalized use case. So jump right in. And so just introduce myself. As Carol mentioned, Joe Moles of Red Canary. I've been doing various defensive security for coming up on about 15 years now. My current role, I lead the detection ops side of our CERT team. So everything that focuses on finding bad guys, from threat hunting to developing new detection techniques, and everything in between is where my team focuses. So this is a topic of much passion of mine, and I favorite to talk about. Also, I would encourage everybody as we move through this to please post questions, and I will try and interleave those questions and answers into the conversation as we go. So overview of what we're going to be talking about. First, just discussing what's the difference, or as I see it, between traditional monitoring and continuous threat hunting. Moving into detection versus and an alert focus, and how that relates to threat hunting. Moving that bar from purely ad hoc to a really operational process. Part of that is talking about how do you measure and what do you measure. And then finally, staffing and team structure, which I think for any operational process, but especially when it comes to threat hunting, really kind of caps off that whole subject. So first thing out of the gate, what are we talking about here? I've been in conversations, and this is kind of can be a hot button discussion of what's the difference between monitoring and continuous threat hunting, and is there a difference? First thing I'll throw out is a couple of definitions I pulled from a couple different places. The first is, monitoring, which is, the focus here is ongoing awareness. This is from a NIST article, and I won't read it, but I'll just kind of key off the points that I see. Is it's mostly focused around continuous visibility. Traditionally in a SOC environment, and as I think about it, it's looking at, in triaging alerts that are coming in from your systems, or it's in outside of the SOC environment, it's working on looking at dashboards, looking at alerts, looking at notifications to see if the systems are operating in the way they see. Operational process. This is from a study, Kirshner. I'd look it up. I believe, if I remember correctly, it was part of a Penn State University or University of Pennsylvania. I forgot to update on my notes, but this was the discussion is that operational is properly executing, and they highlight that, and I think that's really key. When I talk about operational, and this is where I really thrive and love to live, is that you have measurements, you have repeatable processes, you have consistency, and it's really, you've really dialed in it, and it's a consistent, ongoing process. And then finally, threat hunting. This is from our friends at Carbon Black, but the pursuit of abnormal activity. Other definitions I will throw in there on top of that is it's hypothesis driven. Friends at SANS, that's one of the key points is, it's a hypothesis driven. It's typically in some form retroactive is another key point on a lot of definitions. And again, I'm not going to dive too deep into any of these definitions, but I just wanted to throw some of these ideas out there from a context perspective to set the tone of the conversation. So I'm going to lay out some assertions. First assertion is that traditional security operations monitoring is alert driven. The idea being that your traditional SOC, your traditional tier 1 analyst, and maybe even your tier 2 analyst, their job is to consume system alerts, whether those are from your IDS, IPS, your MSSP, your SIM, et cetera, their job is to take an alert, a notification, triage that, and then do something with it. So it's that alert driver that drives that monitoring process. Second assertion is that alerts are intended to be 100% true positive. Now, they don't always hit that mark, but that's traditionally when you're looking at an alerting system, you want that alert to be as close to 100% accurate, 100% this is something bad that you need to do something about. That's the point of an alert. You get an alert on your car, and that means, hey, something's wrong with your car. You get an alert from one of your security systems, that means there is something wrong that you need to go and do something about. And that's traditionally how we've built monitoring processes or defined monitoring programs around. Your traditional SOC monitoring is somebody who's triaging and reviewing and figuring out how to route your alerts and what actions need to be taken based on an alert. Third is 95% of alerts go uninvestigated. This is a stat that's been thrown around from different providers, different analysts, this type of thing. But as a general rule across our industry, 95% of alerts generated by systems that we use for security monitoring, security alerting go uninvestigated. That's a lot of, whether it's because of noise, whether it's because of false positives, whether it's because of alert fatigue, there's any number of reasons. But 95% of the things that our systems tell us about and say, hey, bad thing happened, don't go any further than that. So what does that mean? Everybody's seen the Iceburg graphic. It's a popular graphic in our industry, but it tells a really good story. The top part of the iceberg is that 5% that actually somebody does something with. The bottom part is all the scary stuff that's running around in your environment that doesn't get seen, that dwell time for the actor running around on your environment for days, weeks, months. The top side is typically what our monitoring process is. Those are the alerts. That's what we typically look at. The bottom side is your data driven. This is where your threat hunting comes. This is digging through all of the other information, doing that retroactive hypothesis driven activity. And this is also typically where the actual breach activity comes from. So fourth assertion, if an alert is 100% positive, triage should be automatic. So what does that mean? So that means if you know that this alert, every time this alert fires, you know what this means, that should be handled by a machine. There's no reason for a human to be involved in that process. If I get an alert that says, this is bad, there should be a static route and a static process that moves that through the system. Now, on the other side of that, you may have, that may not be automated. Your response and what actions you take on the other side of that may not be 100% automated, but the triage, the defining the next step action should be automated. This is what machines are good at. Flow chart decisions. You don't need a human to do that. That's almost a waste of human resources to have them review, your 100% or near 100% true positive alerts. Build in the system, get those off of your team's plate. So then what does that do? Now we start talking about, taking that 5%, those alerts, and we're going to automate. We're going to build systems around that to automate that and deal with that. We kind of jokingly say on my team that our tier 1 is a bunch of robots because we automate the things that we know are consistently one thing and dial those processes in. Let's push those off. Let's take that 5% of alerts that get processed and let's figure out how to just automate that off. Now we can focus on, we free up that time because even though it's 5% of alerts, it's not 5% of that human time. So now we can take, that human time and we can use that to investigate. We dig in, we dive in, we focus, we do that hunt process. So after assertions, number 5, the goal, move beyond alert-driven, security. This is what we're talking about. Using a threat hunting processes, but doing it in an operational manner. changing the bar. We're going to take the inverse. Instead of driving by alerts and only looking at 5% of the things, we're going to automate 5% of things and look at the other 95% of the data. That's where the real gold lies. That's where the hunt process drives from. So again, just to reiterate, what our typical SOC monitoring process: we generate an alert, analyst triage it escalates for investigation, or moves on. Very static. This is what we're going to automate. We're going to move past this. This is what we're going to move to. This is, this threat hunting maturity model. We want to get into that 3 and 4, but we can even start. If you're just starting, you can start building this into an operational process now. So that 0, again, your traditional alert driven. You're not collecting a lot of data. There's little routine data collection, and you're relying primarily on those automated alerts. Moving down to those 3 and 4s, you're continuing to create new analysis procedures. These should be one of the outcomes of your hunt. You're also collecting all the right data, and then that final side is automating the most of your successful procedures. Again, one of the things that should be the output of your hunt is, what can we automate out of this? What did we learn? What can we automate? And continuing, to peel back those layers. To use a Shrek reference, your hunting process should be like an onion. You peel a layer, figure out what you can automate, figure out what you learned, and then move on to the next one. So everything in layers, and it's continually peeling that back, moving things off, learning, tuning, and making that a very circular and data-driven process. So we're talking, this is all, again, maturity. So again, take what we're doing. Maybe it starts off as ad hoc. If you're starting a team or you're starting a process, yeah, you take, maybe it is ad hoc. So we're going to take that, but do it. That's the big thing, is do it and learn from it and put some goals around it. Then start aligning your processes with those goals. What are we trying to achieve? We're trying to automate more of our alerting, take processes that don't require human time, figure out how to make them more efficient and automated, and focus more on where we see our risks. And then moving to fully operationalize. And when I say fully operationalize, it should be a consistent, repeated process where you actually have good measures of success and actions and time taken, from your team. So this should be this becomes the regular process. This becomes the focus of what your team does, as opposed to that first level and process, or where it's very ad hoc and it's kind of at the will and whim of time and people. So when we look at this, what does this actually start looking like? We have two kind of circular processes. On the left, this is what I consider kind of your operational threat hunt process. You're going to get an alert or a notification because we've automated those queries or those hypotheses. We investigate, we tune that, and this has got to be part of driving that operational, is tuning that to based on what you learn. Then you're going to, we can broaden our search. So that means, hey, based on what we learned, can we take something and can we, does that create a pivot? Does that create a bigger question that we need to dig into? We change that focus by, either tuning out some noise or pivoting and coming up with a new hypothesis. And then we feed that back into the system to go do that, to ask that question for us. And I use alert here in a different context. On the right side, this is your standard kind of scientific process. You develop a theory, you make observations, you think of interesting questions based on your observations, you formulate your hypothesis, you develop testable predictions, and then you gather test data, and then you use that to refine, reject, expand. And that's the same thing. Threat hunting is that hypothesis driven. So you could replace on that left side, you could replace alert with hypothesis. And my team, what we do is, we think of this as we use the hypothesis. If I see I read an attack, I thought of something terrible that I could do if I was the attacker. I know where we're weak in our environment, whatever that case may be. That's where I think an attacker is going to be, or this is something that they're going to have in their behavior. So I want to go look at that. the other part of that is, if you can build out systems to go and do that initial front end look for you, but the intent here is not to be an alert in the traditional sense where, hey, this is something bad. This is, in the sense that the system raised something up that's going to drive my investigation and cut down that first part of digging into the data. So maybe in your ad hoc on your SIM, in your Splunk instance, in your EDR platform, in your Bro logs, whatever data set you're looking in, in that ad hoc space, you may be doing that very manually. You're looking into that data and you're going and asking that question manually. What you want to get to is asking that question in an automated fashion. If you've got a good hypothesis that's workable and scalable, you plug that in your system and you run that on some sort of schedule, whether that's a stream process, whether that's a scheduled query, whatever is the driver for that, but use that to cut down some of that manual lookup time and get that in front of a human and let that human then use that as that pivot point to dive into the data. So how does this look for my team? So my team we work solely in endpoint data. So what we're doing is we're collecting all of that data. We're establishing our hypothesis. And again, these hypotheses could come from any number of places. It comes from, hey, I read some new report that somebody said about an actor, a threat technique, something when, some researcher put something out on Twitter. I'm looking at where I have gaps in my capabilities that I know about, looking at like kill chain or MITRE, or just, hey, I wonder what this looks like. How frequently does this happen? And is this really anomalous? One of my teammates likes to use the term, it's an inverse of a known truth. So known truth, for example, in endpoint data, if you're in a Windows system, the parent process of SVC host should always be services. That's my known assumption. Standard Windows processes, services.exe should launch SVC host. So what I want to is what's the inverse truth? What other things are launching SVC host? Because my assumption or my hypothesis is that shouldn't happen. So then we're going to actually do the hunt. Let's do that initial manual hunt, see how frequently this happens, and see what we can learn from that. Is my assumption, is my hypothesis true that only services.exe should launch SVC host? If I prove that's true by either finding some bad things using SVC host, or maybe it's just the volume of that in the frequency of that, that inverse truth of something other than services launching SVC host occurs, I can create a detector. I can create something that queries for that and use that to pivot. Now, the other thing I'm going to do is make notes, about what I've seen. So maybe, I have a tool that launches SVC host, but it's a benign process and we know about it. Cool, let's make some notes about that and be aware of that and learn from that. But then we're going to codify that behavior and then use that as a pivot point to drive investigation. So we're not going to assume that this is always bad. We're just going to assume that this is interesting when it happens. And I think that's, again, part of the differentiator between alert and then more automation around that threat hunt idea. Is instead of looking for a known truth or a known occurrence of this is bad, this is, hey, this is potentially interesting and it's going to drive and kind of shortcut that initial data gathering. So then we're going to feed that you're going to use that to drive and feed the hunt team, the analyst team. And then what they can also do is then the aggregate of those concepts pulled together may, again, shortcut some of that investigation, shortcut some of that hunt. Hey, I see SVC host being launched by foo.exe. That's weird. What do we know about foo? And then maybe, a parallel process or something else does something else interesting. Maybe, we see from also foo launches PowerShell that uses an interesting command line flag. And those two things together, again, help narrow that focus of that investigation, that search. And then what we're finally going to do is we investigate, make some decisions on that, and then we're going to take those decisions and those things we learned, and we're going to immediately put them back into the system. again, this is part of that how that process has to operationalize that process and make it scalable. Is this you have to all in one kind of sit down and look through the data. We have to close that loop. So that loop all happens at once. It's not separate processes. It's all part of the same process. So example of this. What are we talking about? So in this case, on the left side we have a execution of PowerShell. Anybody familiar with some of the fun that Matt puts out? This is invoke mimikatz, pretty commonly well known. If you're looking at like your PowerShell logs and everything in any system, this is probably something you got looking at. Now on the other side is those different behaviors or different concepts that we've built in. Some of these are more going to be more accurate, like evil posh module. So then we're looking for things like invoke mimikatz. Those PS files that we know are associated with terrible things, whether it's red teamers, whether it's actual attackers, some of the things we know. Other interesting behaviors is PowerShell using the download string command. So you see in that PowerShell command, there's the .download string and the reference to HTTPS. Using the invoke expression, so the IEX. And again, some of these happen fairly frequently, especially as PowerShell gets more and more used as a system automation tool and everything like that. But each of these in and of themselves is potentially interesting. Depending on your environment, looking for every instance of invoke expression on PowerShell may or may not be, scalable, but as you learn your environment, you can be able to tune and just make those determinations. Is that something interesting? Maybe you can overlay some additional data around that. Hey, I don't think anybody from the finance department should ever launch PowerShell with with any form of invoke expression. Again, specifically looking for references to mimikatz, and looking for just PowerShell referencing a URL. So again, there's some overlap in here, and that's fine because these are all different. These may or may not overlap in the future, but these are in of themselves just interesting things that we're going to use to dive into a process and try and bubble up or shortcut some of that investigative effort, understanding that this isn't always going to be something bad. So digging in, this is how we're codifying this. So this is a snapshot from our portal view, but what we've actually done is we've taken these ideas and we've also codified them and built them into we have a GitHub repo with functional tests and everything. And I would recommend, like, as you're operationalizing this, make sure you have these consistent processes so that you're recording and learning from this, and you're keeping notes on this. And this side, on the left side, notes that we're keeping. Hey, this maps to this square on MITRE. We got some basic, information on description, and then you have your codified reference. This is all written in Ruby syntax, but again, pretty simple. We're looking for a Windows box launching some form of PowerShell, and that PowerShell either has a reference to a web URL, so HTTP, HTTPS in the command line. Super simple. Again, this may be super noisy in your environment. If you got running a bunch of stuff in Azure or AWS or Google or anything like that, where you're doing Windows administration via PowerShell, but it might not be. And again, this is just one concept that you can try in your environment. But again, it's build this into the system, get this into a repeatable process, and then close that loop. So what are we doing here is, again, that we have to complete that complete circle. So in this case, what we've done is we built in an interface to say, hey, you know what? Tune as you go. If this led to nothing, we don't need to see this again. So again, taking some of that, modern concepts and then, applying threat hunt, your traditional ad hoc threat hunt processes and merging them together, so putting that tuning process and closing that loop so you can use, you can go on a hunt, or automate that, that first part of the hypothesis, ask the question of the data, and then based on what you've learned and going through and doing that investigation, take an appropriate action, which is either, hey, we need to start a response process, or hey, we learned something new about the environment, and we don't need to review that specific thing again. And what these options, we use the MD5 hash and then the parent, and then we overlay that with either parent or command line or user ID. But in your environment, that may be different. Using this on like an ArcSight environment, you've got your active filters and you can add that to your filter. So keep updating your filter again, or if you're using a Splunk, again, add that to update your filter as you go, update your query as you go. Any of your sim tools, any of those type of systems should allow you to make those changes and keep doing that. And as you investigate something, whatever things you can tune out, do that as part of closing that loop and do that cyclically so that you can keep asking more and more broad questions and taking on new hypotheses in what you're doing. So then we get into, so we got this process, we're automating and everything, but the other side of being operational is measurement. So this is a snapshot from one of our internal dashboards that we're tracking this stuff. And some of the things that we look at is, from a measurement standpoint, how we assess the value of a hypothesis, of a hunt idea is, how many things do we have to look at? How many occurrences did this have over a time period? How much time, so claim time, how much time did this take of, human capacity? And then how often does this return into something bad? So, and again, these are stats that make sense for us. You can adjust those. If you look, it's kind of small on the bottom, but you're seeing like out of 800, we had 872 times that this occurred in our time period. Of that, 61 were related to something that we said, hey, this was a malicious or suspicious activity that we needed to start up a response process for. And looking at that, and granted, this is, as a service provider, this is looking over the multiple customers, but, keep some metrics on this. Part of being able to understand, is your process efficient? Are you getting value out of your process? Are the things that you're looking for, do they make sense? Are they converting? Are they wasting a lot of human time? Or are they actually producing fruit? And is that, time being spent in the right places effective? The other thing is, if you're, your manager, your senior level analyst or engineer, this is this type of information you need to have to show the value to your team. And again, part of being operational is having valuable measures to understand what you're doing is converting and adding to the security of your team, which is always a fun question of what am I getting for my money? If anybody's ever had to answer that question from a CIO or other C-level management, hey, what is the cost of this security? How are we improving? What are we seeing? And then diving in, this is the other side of all this that I think it gets me really excited. It takes a team. How do you build this team to make this an operational thing? How do you move again from that ad hoc of, hey, my analyst has got some time, or he got some IOCs, or he read a report, and so we're going to do a hunt to see if that exists, to how do we get the right group of people to make this a systematic, reoccurring process that we can do day in, day out with good measures, with good results. So these are the three things that I look for when I built my team. I look for skills, I look for knowledge, and I look for interest. And those three things are how I profile the team. Now, this may be part of your security team, part of your security, or I'm a big fan of part of building out these threat hunts, and again, making this a consistent process is also building stuff where you're pulling in people from other teams in the organization. Maybe you have your core team that's doing this day in and day out, and then part of your your efforts as you're training and you're reaching out to other teams. Maybe you're pulling in your marketing team, and they bring some unique knowledge about the environment, about the data, about trends in what they're working on, what's going on in your industry, or maybe it's from HR, HR, IT, whoever. Do they have these three things as it applies to going on a hunt? So specific to that hunt team or that security team as its core, some of the skills that I look at, data analysis skills. You're looking at a bunch of data. You want to have a good analyst. Scripting and coding. I've always been a fan of the adage that the best sysadmins are those that try and automate themselves out of the job. Same thing, I think, for anybody in a hunt organization is, driving that automation, using tools, using new techniques that write those tools to make the team more effective. Investigative IR. Again, the purpose of a hunt is to dig through data and find the occurrence of something that's happened and be able to use that to, trigger a response process. So having somebody who's familiar and can quarterback that response process and has those skills, top-notch. Research. Again, we're using scientific methodologies. And so somebody who knows that and understands that and brings that to the table is awesome. Other side, what knowledge? Again, I'm a huge proponent of your sysadmins. These are the guys, the backbone of an IT program. They also usually know, one, where you're weak, where you're strong, how users are trying to get around things, where there's legacy systems. Using that knowledge is huge. Plus, again, knowing the ins and outs of your systems, knowing the ins and outs of how to effectively use your routers for network data, how to use your system logs for server data, how to use those different tools and things. Incident management. Again, going back to that investigation and IR, does somebody know how to quarterback when you find that bad thing? They know how to quarterback and coordinate that and communicate that both up and down to your boots on the ground, but also up to your management and how they are. Tribal knowledge. This is, I think, one of the ones that sometimes has a negative connotation, but I think this is really important. One of the best ways this is, I've heard this described, and I give a call out to Casey Smith on the team for being the one that kind of turned me on to this idea. But you want to funnel your adversary by putting the appropriate controls and knowing where your weak points are. So having that tribal knowledge of your environment. Hey, I know I have really good controls around the keys of the kingdom environment, except this one path that we have to leave open. And knowing that one path, is critical, because again, where you want to develop your focus is focusing on those areas where you don't have as much coverage. So the other side of this is, don't try and boil the ocean. These things should be targeted. And so knowing where to target those things, knowing you as the defender, hold the keys of the kingdom, where the walls are, where the holes in the wall are, focusing your visibility and your reviews and your hunt processes around where those holes are is going to be really important. And then obviously adversarial behaviors. This is going to be, how did your bad guys operate? Maybe you pull in somebody from the red team. This is where you build your purple team, understanding both the tactics and techniques, but also the motivations. What's your risk profile, and what's somebody going to be attacking you for? Are you a retailer and PCI data is the critical system? Maybe you're a manufacturing corporation or a research facility, and IP is the real value. Government agencies, depending on what you are, but understanding how and why an adversary is going to attack you, becomes becomes important too, to know, again, how you're going to, where you need to focus, what do you need to look for, how do you come up with those ideas, and tracking all of this. So cutting this a little bit, finishing up to the, getting to the end of the discussion a little bit early, but I'm going to dive into a couple questions here, and also do a call out here for anybody going to the SANS Security Operations Summit. I'm going to be talking there more about team building and kind of building out that threat hunt team in more depth, and how I've done it. And then finally, we'll jump into some questions here. So first, is what kind of data from a hunt perspective, and I'm paraphrasing here, from a hunt perspective, do you need to have to, again, make this operational? I think you need to have your core data sets. Work with what you got. Depends on your environment. I'm a big fan of EDR data, but network data is super helpful, and then your standard log data. But also try and keep it a little bit more focused, and not try and pull in all of the things to do all of the data. Focus your data sets and your hunt operations and your automation around what makes sense. The other question that came up is can a team do this from the beginning? If you don't have a threat hunt team, do you have to focus? Can you jump right to an operational aspect? And I say yes. I mean, the ultimate goal is always to move to an operational, and so you can, in parallel, again, focus on the core and understand what you've got. Is set that goal of moving towards that. So build in some designated time where you're tuning your alerts and you're doing your triage for those type of things, but making sure you have the right data, have the right systems in place, and move that forward in parallel. So as you're building out those things, focus, make sure you have the data set, and then start building your process of how you review it and how you hunt through that. Got another question here. So a question is, how does software interact with clients, and is client-side software needed? It depends on what you're collecting. So I use client-side software, again, because we use endpoint data, so we're using EDR data, so there's an agent logging all of that. So whether you're using Carbon Black, CrowdStrike, Cybereason, Sysmon, OS Query, or you're rolling something like if you're in a Linux-heavy environment, you might not be able to have to do a client. Maybe you've got audit deconfigs. The new Windows, a lot of the Windows logging you can do with native, logging, and on how that works. We specifically use Carbon Black, CrowdStrike to collect all of that data and feed it back to us. But again, it depends on what you're working with and what your environment is. And that's the other thing, is start with the systems and the tools that you have available to work through that. I think that's about the end of the questions. And again, wrapping this up a little bit early, and I apologize for that, or you're welcome for that as you see that appropriately. Part of this was intended to be part with my coworker Kyle, but he decided to break his foot. So if you see Kyle or Kyle, hit him up and ask him about risk mitigation. He'll have an interesting story of how that relates to snowboarding. So thank you all for attending today, and have a good rest of your afternoon. I will turn it over to Carol for wrap up logistics, and go from there.
All right, well, thank you so much, Joe, for your great presentation, and to Red Canary for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.